can make fish soup from fish, but you can't make fish from fish soup. Last week, pitching into an increasingly fevered Hungarian election campaign, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán coined a new proverb. As we might say in English, you can't put toothpaste back in the tube. He was talking about immigration, but it's also how the wider world is looking now. In the Middle East, President Trump has unleashed Operation Epic Fury and made a martyr of the leader of a country that venerates martyrdom. Trump seeks regime change, but he only has power to create regime fall. Can anyone put Iran back together again? 2015's war in Syria spilled a massive wave of migration across the continent. The consequences of that are felt daily in Europe, no matter how much regret the likes of Angela Merkel now offer. Meanwhile, in Britain, the Green Party won a tense by-election, booting the incumbent Labour Party into third place. The Greens had never even won a by-election before. The difference was that the massive Muslim vote in that constituency switched to the more Gaza-friendly Greens. All over, the problem of the last 30 years of mass migration is one that feels intractable. In France, a parliamentary assistant for a deputy of the radical left France Unbowed Party has been arrested as one of 9 charged with the murder of a student, Quentin Durand, a member of a hard-right sect. He was beaten to death in plain day at a protest. On April 12th, Hungary's voters will have to make their own choice. Orbán wants to warn them that in politics, most change doesn't come with an undo function. It's hard to get that message across in a democracy. The truth is, people just get tired of you, and he is now the longest-serving premier in Europe by quite a distance. So, will this great survivor of European politics prevail? Will the Hungarian people go with the salty old fish they know, or choose to sup on a brand new bouillabaisse with possibly some dubious chunks floating at the bottom? Iran, migration, and the irreversibility of change, this time on View from the Danube. Hello, welcome to View from the Danube. I'm your host, Rod Dreher. We're joined today by Raymond Ibrahim, who is a visiting fellow at the Danube Institute and the author of The Sword and the Scimitar. And as usual, Callum Nicholson, also here at the Danube Institute, and Philip Pilkington, a macroeconomist who is also a visiting fellow at the Danube Institute and probably the most energetic guy on X about the Iran war. We're going to talk about the Iran war today, Philip. Now, I should say to our listeners and viewers that the war is obviously an extremely fluid situation. So the picture we're going to give them today may not be the picture next week, or it might be. What's your take on what's happened?
Well, I suppose we should start with where it started, right? I mean, the plan, as far as anyone can tell, on the part of the Trump administration was some sort of a decapitation strike of the leadership, probably the Ayatollah, who was killed, of course, and senior IRGC command, that's Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, who kind of run the country behind the scenes in a lot of ways. And, you know, some of the initial strikes, I guess, were a success on their face. The Ayatollah Khamenei was killed. But the regime hasn't collapsed. I mean, that's very clear. So what is happening now is it's transitioning into a form of attrition warfare, actually. But the attrition warfare isn't like what we see in Ukraine or have seen in Ukraine since 2022, which is attrition ground warfare. A lot of drones, artillery fire, and so on. It's a form of missile attrition warfare. So it's all standoff munitions, very far away from each other. The United States and Israel, I should say, are mainly using planes. It's very much contested whether the airspace is open in Iran. I won't make any comment. I think a lot of the strikes, as far as I can tell, are standoff munitions, Jason bombs, Tomahawks, a lot of Tomahawks being used from the fleet that was brought down. And then the Iranians are responding with very heavy short-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles, which we're seeing rain down all over the Gulf. I mean, Israel's getting hit, got hit in the 12-day war, it's getting hit again. But
Qatar, Bahrain.
well, that's what's changed. So in the 12-day war, everything was focused on Israel. Currently, the Gulf states are being hit. And specifically, the American bases in the Gulf states are being hit. They're not the only thing being hit. Dubai is being hit very heavily. Airports are being hit. Energy infrastructure, we can talk about that later.
We'll get into that in a bit.
So what you have is the beginnings of a form of attrition war, but using missiles. And I'll just say that this was pretty... I'm not even saying it was predictable from my point of view, but if you just read Pentagon and American think tank, CSIS is the big missile expert in DC, they knew that this is what a war with Iran would look like. They always knew it would be a form of missile attrition warfare, unless a decapitation strike were to work. I suppose conceivably that could have happened. So in a lot of ways, what's happening is kind of predictable. And the reason that I'm talking about it on X so much is because I've read a lot about it. And I'm not reading particularly exotic sources. I'm reading the same sources that nominally should be read in the Pentagon and so on. So that's kind of what it looks like on an overall point of view now. And as you said, the situation's incredibly fluid. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone by next week.
Callum, what's your take on what's happened so far?
Well, I mean, I think it's all a bit concerning, honestly. I mean, I think we'll remember the second Iraq war and what happened there. Obviously, if you change anything, you remove the leadership, then you're never really too sure what the unintended consequences might be. So there's always that worry. But there's two other things I think about. One is that if you look at the Ukraine-Russia war, what Russia have that, in a sense, the West doesn't have, they can be patient. And the Russians have always been able to be patient in wars and wait people out, be it waiting for winter or just waiting for the will of the public to support a project to dissolve. And I think Iran probably have more patience. I know the Americans are on like a 60-day timeline right now before it needs congressional approval for some sort of action, and the Iranians can probably outwait that. But the other thing I think about, I've read a bit about the Iran-Iraq war from the 1980s, and if you've read about that, you realize what Iran is capable of in terms of committing people to a cause. And I think something that we don't understand in the West is if you have a regime that is deeply ideological and committed and are willing to martyr people for the cause, then that's quite difficult to overcome that sense of like almost morale in a sense. Even though Iran is being crushed materially, there is an argument to be made that the morale is being crushed into a kind of a hard diamond of resistance. And so I think that the real question is whether the Americans have the stomach for a protracted conflict.
Well, that's a good point, because I remember in the Iraq War, 2003, so many of us Americans had come to believe that all the Iraqis were like the exiles who were encouraging the war, that they were all going to welcome us as liberators and turn into a liberal democracy. I think we're seeing a replay of the same thing here when a lot of us, and anybody with a heart, has to feel sorry for what the Iranian people have had to go through under the regime of the mullahs. At the same time, they've got a lot of support. I want to turn to Raymond. Raymond, you're a professional historian. Your book, The Sword and the Scimitar, is a history of the long conflict between Islam, various armies of Islam, and the West. How do you read what's happening now through a historical lens?
Yeah, good question. And that's exactly how I do see it, kind of the long view. And sort of going off what Callum said is, I think we're projecting a lot, and we're falling back on the old paradigms, old models of the Saddam Hussein and Afghanistan, and we think it's going to be in that exact order, and things are going to be simple. Not that they were necessarily simple, but that they'll follow those paradigms. I think with Iran, it's a little different because it is a religious it's the largest actual Islamic republic in the region, and it's also Shia. And so, based on what Callum was saying, for example, we've essentially made a martyr of Khamenei. I mean, that's it. He's actually now seen. It's not that, of course, in the West we can say he's an evil terrorist, etc. But there, it's actually galvanizing people to a great extent.
The supreme leader,
yeah, and who apparently knew that where he was not safe, and he willingly stayed there. So that even kind of feeds into it. But I also see it from the lens of what very few people and policymakers are aware of, the idea of Mahdiism, because Iran is not just Muslim, it's Shia Muslim. And of course, they have their major differences and similarities. But what's notable is they really have a strong eschatological component to their worldview.
Meaning like end of the world.
End times kind of thing. And there's a Mahdi figure. Mahdi means the guided one. And it's a long story about who he is and where he comes from and how he manifests himself. He's actually supposed to be one of the imams of the Shias who went into what's called occultation and disappeared.
The hidden imam.
Yes, and he's going to come back. Now, one of the ways to bring him back is to fight Islam's greatest enemies, which from Iran's perspective, it's named them, the two great Satans, of course, Israel and America. And so my point is that this sort of theological worldview is actually in a way is working with Iran against the U.S. and Israel in a possibly in a really bad way, because what I'm trying to say is when you talk about nuclear powers, right? The whole idea of nuclear powers is the balance theory, right? The balance of power, deterrence. You have it, I have it. No one's going to press the button. But when you have people who are ideologically driven, and the component that is, or the one group that is especially indoctrinated in the idea of Mahdiism, is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, actually. Okay.
Now, help us understand the conflict within the Muslim world in the Middle East. You mentioned that Iran is a Shia power. The Gulf Arab states are Sunnis, and I've been going to the Middle East for a while, and all of the Gulf Arab states were terrified of Iran, of the Shia superpower. How should we read this conflict now that Iran is attacking America's Sunni allies in the Gulf?
Well, in that context, it's just attacking the Sunni Arabs because they are American allies. And in that case, I guess there would be soft targets, easy targets for Iran. But in the greater picture of things between the Sunnis and Shias, and to give you just a very succinct summary of how they come about, it was about a succession crisis that dealt after Prophet Muhammad dies. So the Sunnis were essentially the majority, who are 90% of the Muslim world, who believed in anyone could be a caliph or a successor of Muhammad, whereas the Shias was the one small group that believed it had to be his blood, and generally would go through his daughter Fatima and his first cousin Ali, and Ali's the first imam. Okay, and then they go, and the imam in Shia theology, so that's the thing, the Sunnis don't have the imam, they have imams, of course, prayer leaders, but the imam in Shia theology is like an immaculate character. He's perfect. And people like the supreme leader and the Ayatollah, they're seen as his kind of representatives and voice while he's hidden. So it's the very mystical aspect to it, but it also makes that kind of mentality, that worldview, much more prone to using nuclear weapons, because it's actually meant to usher in. You can't bring the Mahdi without ushering in the end times by attacking and ideally obliterating your enemies. So that's why I was saying earlier, the balance of power theory doesn't work very well when you think about a group like that who thinks that way. But insofar as the Sunni and Shia thing, that's just been going on for centuries, and basically America's allies are the Sunnis, which is also ironic. One last point is because the Sunnis, who are our great allies, are actually much more prone to being what we call radical Muslims.
Right.
So Islamic terrorists, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, you name it, are Sunnis. Okay, so that's a little interesting.
It's interesting you bring up the religious angle here, which is not something that most of our planners in the West think about. There was a report on X that one American lower-level commander told his troops that Donald Trump is leading us in a war that will bring back Jesus Christ. And that is not a common view within Christianity, but there's a subset of Christians, usually those who are very much allied with Israel, who believe that and believe there is a religious dimension here. This is why I was very alarmed the other night, right after the war started, when the Iranians started sending missiles into Jerusalem. They had one that struck right outside the old city. It was half a mile from the Dome of the Rock, which is on the Temple Mount. Now, among a certain number of evangelical Christians in America, they believe that the Jewish temple has to be rebuilt on the Temple Mount in order for Christ to return. And if that missile were to have landed on the Dome of the Rock, I mean, that would set off an electrifying effect, at least among Americans, and also among Israelis who are more religious. But the thing that worries me most about this right now, from a political point of view, is Donald Trump did not prepare the American people for this. I mean, George W. Bush spent over a year preparing the Americans politically for war with Iraq, which was always going to be a much easier thing for America, even though it didn't turn out to be easy at all. But Trump ran into this war. Most people in America are against this war, according to the polls. And I think even among the Republicans, only about half of Republicans support this war. Do you see, Philip, political risk here for Donald Trump and also for the leaders in Europe?
So I think there's kind of a couple of components to this. So the first of it is exactly what you've just said. The public were not prepared for this war. When America went into Iraq, it had been nearly 2 years since 9/11. I mean, there was,
72% of the American people agreed with the war when it was launched.
That's right. And people remembered 9/11. They were really shook up about it. That's not the world we live in today. And people haven't been prepared for this war in America. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is increasingly I see signs that this war is becoming partisan, actually, in America, much quicker than the Iraq war did. That took a while. It took a protest movement to grow up. And it only really became established when Barack Obama got elected the first time. Today, this morning, the New York Times is publishing photographs of American bases that have been severely damaged. Now, I don't want to sound like a crazy conspiracy nut, but generally in warfare, you suppress those photos. You don't show them to the public. It's an American base, and there's been a lot of damage.
So the media aren't playing along.
The media aren't playing along with this. And if they're getting leaks of those photographs, people in the Pentagon aren't playing along, because I don't think a lot of people in the establishment are in favor of this war. And that brings to the third point. This war is far more risky from the point of view of win-lose than Iraq. For some of the reasons that Raymond's just said. It's a Shiite country, and the IRGC, as you say, are holy warriors in a sense. I mean, that's how they view themselves. The current situation in Iran is that the power has been delegated. They have a defense compact, as it were, that they call Mosaic Defense Doctrine. And what they do is they distribute command and control to 30 regional IRGC commanders. Those commanders have some sort of vague tasks: destroy Dubai, attack Israel, this guy. They're pretty much allowed to do what they see fit there. Those guys make the strike decisions. To the extent that there is civilian leadership, it will probably be the new Ayatollah who was elected this morning.
The son of the supreme leader.
The son of the supreme leader. Now, Ayatollah Khamenei too has had his whole family killed. His wife was killed, his child was killed, and his parents were killed. So you've no one to negotiate with. You have a dispersed regional command structure that allows independent IRGC commanders who, if they are killed, have 3 replacements underneath them who will only get more angry as each one is killed. You have that. They're all sitting on top of giant missile bases that are buried underground that you can't airstrike. Some of them have holes cut out. They look like something out of a Bond cartoon or something, where you can actually launch from underneath mountains. I brought some slides along, but we couldn't get them printed up. And then you have this aspect of attrition warfare that I'm talking about. Now, again, just as me talking about the overall strategic picture is coming from fairly mainstream sources like CSIS, what I'm about to say also comes from mainstream sources. America has very limited missiles in the region. They went in with 600 Tomahawks. I think there's probably 150 left today.
And they're not cheap missiles, right?
They're not cheap missiles, but to replace them, you have to bring a ship to dock and you have to use a crane to put them in. It takes a long time. So to restock, to resupply is 2 to 4 weeks, probably on the 4-week side, given the fact that Djibouti is probably going to be under attack soon. So they have about 600 Tomahawk missiles. As far as I can tell, they have about 2,500 to 3,000 interceptors, Patriot and THAAD interceptors in the entire region. I reckon they've spent about 2,000 of them down. This is from reports in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. I'm not going on some obscure Twitter account here. So what that means is that once they run out of ammo, probably interceptors are the main danger.
The US,
the US.
Israelis.
Then they have 2 choices. They can either sit there and take hits, or they can go, or they can leave. But if they leave, the bases are still there, and the IRGC commanders who are now in control of the military can continue striking the bases. In that case, they can go and they can reload the ships, and they can reload the air defense batteries to the best extent that they can. That'll be very difficult. And then they can come back for round 2. And then we have the cycle repeat again. So I just don't see an off-ramp to this. Yeah. Who do you negotiate with? You can't negotiate with the IRGC commanders. They are just given a mission, and they're told to complete it as best they can. To the extent that there is civilian leadership, it's the new Ayatollah, and America, as far as he's concerned, just killed his whole family. So who do you negotiate with here? So the potential here for a catastrophe, and I mean a catastrophic loss of some sort, is so much higher than in Iraq.
Well, I mean, on this, there's a couple of things to say. One is I agree with Philip, and one thing is 6 weeks ago we saw this fermented revolution, counter-revolution in a sense in Iran, and Trump was saying we support you. But the truth is, what ended up happening is I think 20,000 people were, I think it was 20,000 killed, 30,000 killed, and many imprisoned. It tends to be throughout history, but whenever a revolution happens, it's actually quite a small number of people. It's the hardcore people who are really willing, have the means, the courage, just the moment to do something. Those people came out then and have either been killed or jailed. And so there's a real question around whether there is just in the street people right now who form that hardcore to incite some sort of movement to take advantage of the conflict. But the second thing is, I think, and Philip's been hinting at this, the way we tend to think about war in our sort of post-World War II era from the West, we think of war as quite rational, about combat rather than peer-to-peer war. The last peer-to-peer war was probably the Korean War, where it wasn't simply 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 deaths, but so many deaths you can't bury them, you have to leave them behind. And this is not a rational war we're facing. This is something we potentially haven't seen for quite a long time. Although if you're Iraqi, you remember having a war exactly like this with Iran in the 1980s. And I think it's worth noting, and we've hinted at this, that this war has a religious component. Obviously, there's a theocracy, but there's also a degree of evangelism on the other side as well. And so these two things are really, they're 2 millenarian movements, one of which is an apocalyptic millenarian movement that ceases to be rational. But there's something else here. There is the irresistible force of Trump's will behind American foreign policy, and you have the immovable object of a theocracy that cannot collapse. They cannot concede, because if they concede, then they'll be out of power in a week. So they cannot concede. But Trump, have you ever seen Trump ever concede on anything? So you really have this extraordinary situation now where both sides are locked into a position where they cannot back off, which therefore ceases to be, the concept of rationality ceases to be relevant. So I think that it becomes something that's almost impossible to analyze, I think, beyond sort of the emotions involved in existential crisis.
And that means win or lose.
Well, it means win or lose, but the question is, what does win mean? Because one of the challenges, I think, is that my thinking about this is that we often talk these days about World War III, has it started, and so on. My sense has been if World War III will happen, or indeed has already happened, and it's worth noting, when World War II began, they weren't calling it World War II. It took a few instances, a few months before people probably said, oh, this is World War II. No one said it with Poland or the Russians invading Finland and so on. We look back in retrospect and call it World War II collectively. It's arguable, really, that we've been in World War III in a more protracted sense for a few years, but depending on how you define it, it seems to me if we are into World War III, what that will be is the point where the umbrella of American presence and power throughout the world is no longer capable of maintaining the veneer of peace. The Americans have like 10 or 12 carrier groups all around the world. But the truth is, despite having the world's biggest military, they cannot be focused on more than one or two spheres at any one time. And so you've had Venezuela, you've had Ukraine, you had Israel, Palestine, but now this is much bigger. And suddenly what seems to me as possible is when American power is distracted, all of the unfinished business of the 20th century will reopen like poorly sutured wounds. It could be India, Pakistan, it could be Taiwan, China. And World War III really is all of the things bursting out when that umbrella is retreated. And one last thing I'd add to this is that, you know, there is a kind of an uncomfortable parallel really with Biden in some sense with what's happening now. Because when Biden withdrew from Afghanistan, and personally I don't think we ever should have been there, but when he withdrew, what he revealed was the illusion of American moral supremacy. What it revealed, we didn't really care about the girls' education. At the end, it was a cynical decision to leave very quickly and the Taliban returned. It seems to me that if that was sort of puncturing the moral illusion, what this risks doing now is puncturing the illusion of material supremacy, that the Americans actually not just have moral supremacy, but real martial material supremacy, because they're testing it in reality. And that's a very dangerous thing to do in a situation like this. Most of the wars for decades have not been peer on peer. They have been going into a state that was basically already, you know, you knock the door is already off the hinges, you just knock it over. This is, I think, quite different.
Raymond.
Yeah, one of the things that Callum said that I've also been thinking about is when you look at the two opposing sides and who's got more to lose, and it's just very clear Iran has everything to lose, so they're not going to easily capitulate. And I'm pretty sure it seems that the Trump administration was really banking on a kind of decapitation strike that would work instantly. And I don't know if he wants this to be a protracted war, especially since he's told the American people repeatedly he's not going to get us involved in wars, et cetera, et cetera. So definitely, it's already started off unpopular, and it has the potential to really become catastrophic for him, especially.
And now they're talking about, well, we might have to put troops on the ground there. That's
exactly
a red line, politically at least.
He just gambled. He was hoping that, you know, I'm going to kill this guy. And one more thing about him, you know, the guy, the Khamenei that died, he's actually was kind of seen almost as a moderate, because I think he issued a couple of fatwas against using nuclear power as a weapon. Whereas the other guy, the son, he's for it. So it's almost like you got rid of the one guy who was almost, the moderate in that camp, and now they've all going to be extra radicalized, and they already have different, more extreme views as is, and they have nothing left to lose. What else are they going to lose? So they're just really going to buckle in, I think, and dig deep. And whereas I don't know if Americans are ready for that sort of thing.
Now, Philip, you're a professional economist, and you've been writing a lot about the global economic consequences of the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. Tell us what we're facing, what we around the whole globe are facing by that narrow strait through which all of the oil from the Persian Gulf passes.
So this goes to a more general point, and then we can go to the particular. I think Americans especially, but Westerners generally, have massively misinterpreted what the Iranians mean when they say stuff like death to America in the streets. That has been popularized, possibly for propaganda reasons, that they really mean that they're going to develop a bunch of nuclear weapons and fire them off the United States of America. Maybe they would have done that. I don't think they would have. But okay, fine. Maybe they would have. That's not what they're talking about. When they say death to America, they mean death to the American empire. They mean the same thing that the Taliban were saying when they were fighting the Soviets. The Taliban did not want to fight the Soviets to destroy Russia. They wanted to destroy what they saw as the Soviet empire. That is what the Iranians mean when they say death to America. And here's the thing, they have a plan to do it. Because we think, oh, well, it's just another Middle Eastern war. We'll just contain it to the region. You know, even if it goes poorly or whatever, if people are even planning in that direction, I don't know, then, you know, it ends and we're embarrassed and everything like that. That's not what's going on here. The way that the Iranians are going to try and collapse the American empire, as they see it, is financially and economically. And they know exactly how to do this. They're doing two things and potentially three. So we'll start with the smaller. I saw that the bank in UAE was hacked yesterday. The Iranians have quite sophisticated cyber, so they can do a bit of that. Now, that can only get you so far. The targeting of the UAE itself, people are a bit mystified about this. I tweeted Carl Bildt from the ECFR's tweet today. He said, why are 50% of the ballistic missiles flying at...
ECFR is?
The European Council of Foreign Relations. and he's ex-Prime Minister of Sweden, I think. And he said, why are all these missiles, 50%, they were saying, of the missiles were fired at Dubai, at UAE generally. He said, why are they doing this? UAE were nominally against the war. All the Arab states were trying to encourage Trump not to go in. It's because it's the financial hub of the Middle East. They're trying to create a banking crisis by doing that. And they're probably going to succeed because there'll be massive capital flight from UAE. It's very much so connected to the City of London. I've never been to Dubai, but it's full of British bankers, effectively. So it's very much so stitched into the dollar system via the City of London. So the first plank of the economic warfare strategy is to attack the banking system via UAE. And some of the strikes in Cyprus that have already begun could move in that direction too, but UAE is more important. And then there's the big kahuna, which is the closure of the Straits of Hormuz and the attacking of the energy infrastructure, which has already started. So closing the Strait of Hormuz cuts off 15 to 20% of global oil supplies. We have seen that before, not the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, but we have seen an oil embargo in 1973 by the Saudis in response to the Arab-Israeli war in that year. It sent oil prices absolutely bonkers, and it resulted in oil shortages all over the Western world. Cars queuing for
inflation through the roof.
Inflation through the roof, right? So that's basically what closing the Strait of Hormuz does. And then the long-run version of that is attacking the energy infrastructure, which they're doing. So in that case, and this speaks to the fact that they're going all in, they see a total war going on here. So they're going to do whatever. Attack the energy infrastructure, even if you can open the Strait of Hormuz, there won't be anything left to ship through it. It'll take a year to rebuild or something like that. So then you'll get inflation, very severe inflation, probably worse than what we saw after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And at that point, interest rates start to rise. And what the Iranians are hoping that'll do, and it might do, is create a massive financial crisis and a run on US government debt. And a collapse of the American economy, a full collapse of the American economy. This is their plan. I'm not speculating here.
Exciting.
You can read about it.
So it's interesting, because you think of the Middle East, of course, you have the Straits, but you also have those key airports to go from Europe to Asia. You've seen these maps of what's happened to the flights right now. And obviously, you've mentioned the banking system. So you're saying that, in a sense, in the international system that's in the Americans' image, the actual weak point, I almost coincidentally, is next to Iran.
I wouldn't say the weak point, well, but if you think of the financial sector, you have a few hubs, right? You have Hong Kong, you have increasingly China, you have Singapore, you have London, you have New York. To a certain extent, you have maybe Europe in a sense, maybe Frankfurt or something like that. But the one in the Middle East, the one that deals with all the oil revenues and so on, is in Dubai. And what that does is it recycles the dollars in the region earned from oil sales back into things like US Treasury bonds and so on. So the point of the financial system that's currently in place sustains the enormous debt load of the United States and sustains the enormous current account deficit that the United States runs. It's a very fragile system, all in. Now, it's not very fragile day to day because everyone will go along with it. But if you throw a real monkey wrench into that, it could blow up. And that's what the Iranians are planning to do. It's quite a sophisticated economic warfare plan. I mean, they clearly have some economists working on it.
And Donald Trump had said that, well, the U.S. Navy will keep the strait open, but I think that's pie in the sky, because the Navy has to be right all the time. All the IRGC has to do is sink one tanker, and Lloyd's of London, which guarantees the insurance on these tankers, it will withdraw all insurance, right? And
well, Trump is now saying that they're going to create an insurance fund. But look, it is a fantasy to reopen the Strait. They couldn't reopen the Red Sea in the face of Houthi attacks. Iran is like Houthi times 1,000. The Houthi were a little proxy army that they were testing these weapons out. The idea, the Iranians are trying to lure Donald Trump into the Strait of Hormuz. If anyone in the DC is watching this, please pay attention. They're trying to lure Donald Trump in. They have speedboats with short-range anti-shipping missiles in caves all along the coastline of Hormuz. And the moment the US Navy go in there, they're going to sink it. That's their plan. And so if Donald Trump falls for that, there's going to be absolute chaos. And I really, really hope that somebody at the Pentagon or the CIA can tell him this. Because, again, this is not a secret. You can read about it in CSIS reports.
But is this not, sorry, just one quick thing, is that this also is all the more dangerous, I think, because if it's possible for the Americans to be lured in, you've also got, I think, a leadership model on both sides at the moment where neither side will ever concede anything. And so you have the real potential for chaotic escalation, it seems.
Clearly.
And one thing that we're all on pins and needles worried about is the possibility of Islamic sleeper cells in Europe and the United States. And not only the sleeper cells, which as of today have not been activated if they're there, but I think our intelligence services believe that they are there. But we're also seeing the greater Islamification of Europe since we were last here around this table. There's been a hugely symbolic by-election in Gorton and Denton, that's Greater Manchester in the UK, that was won by the Green Party. You know, this constituency has been in the hands of Labour for, I think, 100 years or so. And now Labour was completely destroyed by the Green Party, which is an alliance of the progressive far left and Muslims. What does that tell us about what's happening in British politics and potentially in European politics? This is your wheelhouse, Raymond.
Well, it's the great demographic change that's been happening incrementally, and it's coming home to roost. And what you just said actually it's ironic because a lot of people are always questioning why does the green and the red, as they call them, or the red as in communist or leftist and green Islamic alliance, and you see it often, progressive leftists, and they're being supported by Muslims, and you're wondering what on earth is this? How do the two work? Well, the Muslims are just being cynical, and they're voting them in. I mentioned this before. There's so many examples, especially in America, where areas become very heavy Islamic populations, and the left is always cheerleading them on and helping them and promoting them. And then once they come into power, in one instance in Michigan, the city council became Muslim majority. No, that one too, but this one's I think Hamtramck in Michigan. And when the city council became Muslim majority, the first thing they did, first order of business was to cancel gay pride. And everyone on the left who had were just shocked and mortified. How could you do this? I thought we were allies. So I think what they don't understand, the left doesn't get, is the Muslims are using them cynically, of course, but they don't in any way, shape, or form share any of their ideologies, liberal ideologies. But in general, what's happening, and now with this Iran business and the potential crisis that will happen, which probably will lead to more migrants flooding in, and this feeling that people have that it's now we're obligated to take in more and more. It's just amazing, like I said, because when you zoom out and look at it, the big picture, and because a lot of people are very myopic and they just think in the now, they're very temporal minded. And they can look in their city, let's say in the UK, and it's still under 10% Muslim. So in their mind, that's not a big deal, but it actually is a big deal when you really understand how it's happening progressively. And I saw a Pew report that said by 2050, Germany is set to be about 20% Muslim. And that's without any more immigration, just based on demographic growth of what's already there. So it's just amazing that the continent of Europe, which was essentially the final historic bastion of Christianity, and the white race, and now it's being essentially taken over, both by the Islamic religion and by peoples from from the third world, essentially.
Matt Goodwin, a British pundit, public intellectual, and a former guest last year here on View from the Danube, stood as the Reform candidate in that constituency in Greater Manchester. He lost. But he gave a quote after his loss. He said, quote, "We are losing our country. A dangerous Muslim sectarianism has emerged. We have only one general election left to save Britain." What do you think of that?
I think I do some work on demography. I don't know if I've published anything with Danube, but we've published a few papers in Britain, actually. So Paul Moreland and I, the demographer, did actually the main modeling in Britain for demographic trends and so on. So Britain have had net negative domestic population growth for about 4 years now. And the entire economy kind of relies on immigrant labor because there's no productivity growth. So just from an economic perspective, there's two sources of long-term economic growth. growth in the labor force and growth in labor productivity. There's no, if somebody comes up with a third one, please email the Nobel Prize Committee. So there's no productivity growth in Britain because the economy is completely shot and it's hollowed out, manufacturing's gone, it kind of rests all around the city of London and so on. So the only way to keep GDP growing is to keep immigration coming in. And why do you have to do that? You know, there are discussions in Britain and so on about like, well, maybe we should deprioritize GDP growth and all that. And, you know, I'm not going to be the stereotypical economist here and say GDP means everything. It doesn't. But Britain is also close to bankruptcy. The government's engaged in a massive austerity program at the moment. Debt is too high. It's very hard to issue debt at the moment. And so the Treasury basically forces, my understanding is the Treasury basically forces the Home Office to allow in you know, as many migrants as are needed to grow the economy. Because if they don't, the country just goes bankrupt and they can't afford the welfare state. So I think the problems are actually deeper than people in the reform. I mean, I have a lot of friends there, and I was constantly trying to tell people this. And you know, it's the painful medicine that economists sometimes say, and they, you know, didn't really want to hear it. I'm not saying that therefore you should have, you know, mass migration. I don't think so. It kind of destroys society in my view. But the deep problem here is basically that Britain hasn't had above replacement fertility rates since 1971. That's 50 years. Yeah. And it's starting to catch up with the country. It's got a very high tax rate already. One of the highest in Europe, I'd say. You know, France is higher, certainly, but it is one of the higher ones in Europe. So the Treasury sees no other real alternative. And yes, they could deprioritize GDP growth. I suggested some reforms that could do that. But then you have the issue of borrowing. So you'd have to deprioritize GDP growth, and then you'd have to massively cut the size of the state. So the problems are really deep in Britain.
Callum, you're British. What does this mean politically? Do you think that Matt Goodwin is right? We're one general election away from saving the country. And if not, why not?
Well, I mean, a lot of it comes down to what we mean by saving. I mean, but I think that one thing, that the big sort of theme running through the last 15 years of British politics, actually really the last 25 years since New Labour, or 28, 30 years now maybe, since New Labour when Labour turned into New Labour under Tony Blair, is what I term the sort of ideological gentrification of the left, where the Labour Party was created to represent working class interests, and you know, whatever else is true about the UK is a very class stratified society even to today. And what we've done in that period is strip away the foundations of all the working class communities. One of the things that people don't often talk about when they talk about, say, the grooming gangs or the rape gangs, they're often in sort of northern post-industrial towns. Yes, of course, there's a sort of a cultural element to that. Yes, the police were looking the other way because of political correctness. But the other thing is that these communities were often, where the girls were coming from, were often devastated working class communities where which used to be quite close-knit, and now no one is there. There's no social structure anymore. So these girls are very vulnerable. There's not the neighbors looking out for each other. And
family breakdown.
Family breakdown, which is part of that. And I went to school in Barrow in Furness, which is one of the towns where this was happening in the north. And it's very close to home. But but I think what's happened on the left is you've had it taken over by sort of middle-class political professionals. I mean, even Jeremy Corbyn, who's seen as a great man of the left, grew up in an old rectory and is, I think, university educated and quite middle class, lives in Islington. All of the left were like this. And it's in the same way you have in a city, you have gentrification where the working class population are pushed out because the houses become so expensive. On the left in Britain, you've just had ideological gentrification right across it. And so I have to say, with the UK, Britain is very proud of the fact that we're not a prejudiced country, in the sense that, you know, 100 years ago, people were prejudiced against people from Papua New Guinea, and you would never in Islington at a dinner, no one would ever say anything prejudiced against someone from a foreign nation anymore. But you know what is still an acceptable prejudice in the UK? It's against the provinces and against the working class. And what you will hear is,
class.
Yeah, and so when Brexit happened, people just thought it was a bunch of ignorant racists causing this. It was so dismissive of actually the majority of the country. So I think the political crisis we have is that, and the reason the Greens are getting elected and so on, is that you've just had the Labour Party abandon its sort of working class constituency, and actually the Greens to some extent is a good example of the sort of ideological gentrification where people go for that. So this is where Reform, I think, they didn't win in that, but they're one of the last parties that I think that are actually standing up for the working class interests.
Well, Raymond, let's go to France for a second. Last month, a 23-year-old young right-wing Catholic, Quentin Durand, was murdered by a group of French Antifa. And this has caused shockwaves throughout French politics because the Antifa group was connected to La France Insoumise, which is the far left party. And there have been protests in favor of Quentin, in memory of Quentin. And we have next year the presidential election coming up in France. This has all gone to the benefit of the Rassemblement National, the former National Front. What do you see when you look at France and the Islamization of politics and the Islamo-gauchisme, Islamo-leftist movement?
Honestly, I see everywhere. Everywhere is headed to civil war. To be honest with you, that's the only kind of the culmination of what's going on. Either that, or one group acquiesces and capitulates, namely the or to give them whatever parlance we're speaking in American or Europe, but normal people. I'll put it that way. Okay, the natives. Either they have to capitulate or there's going to be essentially a war, because again, going back to the numbers and the growing the demographic population explosion of Muslims and migrants and so forth, what are you going to do when it's 50%? I mean, or 60%? Now you're an absolute minority. If 10% is creating so much havoc, what's going to happen when it's 30%, which is very realistic and not too far from the horizon. So I think, and we're already seeing this. I think in the UK there's this new party, Reform Britain, I think. And the language coming out is very, it's on the one hand it's refreshing because it's the kind of language that is needed. On the other hand, it's pretty militant. They're not just talking about stopping migration; they're talking about reversing it, which means we're actually going to. But is that bad? No, I think that is actually necessary. That's the point they're in. But once they get to that point, the other side's not going to just give in either. So this is just going to become a massive conflict, literally, of civil war.
One thing I've been talking about a lot for the last year is the prospect of civil war in Britain and in continental Europe. David Betts, an analyst at the King's College London War Studies Department, he's been sounding the alarm for a while now, saying that from what we know from the academic study of civil war, all of the conditions that give rise to civil war have been met in Western Europe and in the UK, specifically with a large and restive migrant population. Is there a way to back away from this? Because I'll tell you, I've been traveling in France, and people will tell you behind the scenes, people in a position to know. I'm thinking of a retired 5-star French general who told me this last year. He said, civil war can't be stopped now. Do you see any way out of it?
Well, I mean, we've talked about this before, but I have a slight resistance on elements of this narrative about civil war because, classically understood, if you look at any definition of civil war, it's two sides fighting for control of the state, like the American Civil War. But the challenge is that what we're seeing, say, in the UK, is you have like the white working class population facing tensions perhaps with the Muslim community in the absence of the state's presence or the state's not doing anything, which is leading to perhaps the potential for communal violence, which
that's
is like...
what that means by civil war.
Yeah, but I don't think they're the same category because I don't think they're fighting for control of the state. It's two sides fighting in the absence of the state's presence.
Okay, it's like Northern Ireland.
Well,
yeah, but this is just arguing over terminology.
I don't think it is, though, because I think civil war is the concept of, again, civil war is two armies essentially fighting over control of the state, the English Civil War or the American Civil War. And I just think these categories do matter. It's not simply an academic exercise because I think the phrase civil war is so loaded. I do think there is risk of communal violence if we don't get community relations improved. But the concept of civil war, I'm not sure what the two sides are fighting for the state.
Well, all right, let's put that aside. And again, Betts said it would be more like Beirut in Northern Ireland. But if it comes to that, I mean, what's the off-ramp here? Is there now an off-ramp, or, to use Viktor Orbán's analogy and something he recently said about, a metaphor about fish soup, which is to say you can't put toothpaste back into the tube. That's how we say in English. Is there any way to avoid this now, or is this just locked in?
I think it's locked in, and it's, like I said, either it happens or one side has to acquiesce and essentially lose its rights to the other side. And I don't see the migrants or the leftists doing that at all.
We're already seeing the quote-unquote solution to it in Britain, and it's what's going to spread all over Western Europe. We're going to have enormous police states. So what people don't really understand, I grew up in Ireland, is that due to the Troubles, Ireland was very police state-ish. I mean, I'm not saying it's a police state. It's not. If you go to Ireland, it's a very free place. Northern Ireland is a slightly different kettle of fish. But the way that the Troubles impacted Northern Ireland was they gave rise to an enormous outgrowth of an internal security service, basically, in both islands. It's never really talked about, but it is true. And what we're seeing now, I think that required a certain level, because although the Troubles got a lot of attention, probably rightly, but they got a lot of attention, the level of violence was actually not as high, if you look at the statistics and so on. I think what's happening now is Britain is starting to prepare for something more dramatic, in a sense. You see it there. You see it, the securitization of society and so on. Anyone who visits there has seen it. I think that's probably the direction to travel, because why wouldn't you? I mean, the state will have an excuse to expand its power. It loves expanding its power. And the new technologies that we're bringing in here mean that you can expand the power much more than you can, say, after the passing of the Patriot Act.
Yeah, AI is going to be huge, and taking human interaction out of the picture. We saw some of this during COVID. I mean, that seems to me like a model for a kind of perfect police state in a way. So I think Western Europe will respond with the policing. That's how the state always responds to violence. It responds policing. And the reason that Britain's slightly ahead of the game here is because it actually had some of the initial structures put in place. Cameras everywhere.
Yeah, these are outgrowths. This is not, people in Britain won't talk about this. I don't understand why, but these are so obviously outgrowths of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And that's why Britain got a kind of a start on the way. But that'll spread across Western Europe, I think.
We have to talk about the Hungarian elections before we go, because we're running out of time. We're about 5 or 6 weeks away from the election, April 12th. It's hard to know what to make of the polls. The polls are showing that Viktor Orbán's challenger, Peter Magyar from the TISA party, is far ahead. But I remember I was here in 2022 for the election. The polls were wildly wrong. Fidesz won in a virtual landslide. So where do we stand on the election now, 5, 6 weeks out, and what are the factors playing into the dynamics? Because I don't know about you guys, but I'm hearing from Americans all the time asking me, who's going to win? Is Orbán going to win?
So maybe I'll start on the polls, because I've done some other kind of quantitative work around the polls. So I noticed that the polls were off last year. About this time last year, I realized that there was something very strange going on in the polls, much stranger than in 2022. You're right that in 2022, the polls did not capture the win. I think the most dramatic polls toward the end of the election showed Fidesz leading by 10 points or something, and they won by some 20 or something. But it was orders of magnitude. All the polls were kind of off in 2022, although the government aligned ones were less so. This time around, what you've seen is that the polls diverged. The polls are now giving completely different readings. So the ones affiliated with the opposition are giving sometimes crazy readings, like a 20-point lead to the TISA opposition party. And the government polls are showing a pretty consistent plus 4% lead for Fidesz. So the polls have completely split. Now that means one thing. One set of polls is fake. And I will say they are fake. No one could bung up the methodology that badly. I don't believe that. I mean, I work on statistics a lot, have for most of my adult life. You cannot do that badly with it. One of the sets of polls is fake. So the only question is, are the government-aligned polls fake, or are the opposition polls fake? And so I ran some tests last month using econometric studies, and I found that the variability in the opposition polls was very high. And what that means is, so there's like 4 pollsters on each side, 4 government-aligned pollsters, 4 opposition-aligned, and their polls don't agree with each other. So the government-aligned pollsters kind of agree that, fluctuation of plus minus 3, the opposition one's plus minus 10. And what that shows you is that there's something funny going on with that polling set. And since then, just to finish, a Hungarian journalist, this is only a week and a half ago, got his hands on the internal polling documents from one of these organizations, Median.
From a pro-TISA?
From a pro-TISA, the main pro-TISA pollster. It's called Median. And what it showed was the poll itself showed 36-36 even. And the published poll reported in the paper showed something like a 7-point TISA lead. Now, the pollster has not addressed this, which is suspicious on its face. But I would say their proxies on Twitter, shall we say, have addressed in a very comprehensive statistical way that they're clearly getting from the Median company, where they said that no, that is before we applied aging weights to them, so weights or whatever. I asked them for the aging weights, they will not produce them. So I strongly suspect that the opposition polls are fake. And so why would they be faking that? Well, they did this in Georgia, for example. It's to discredit the results after the election and say the election was fraudulent.
Right. So, Callum, do you think that if Orbán should win, the EU is going to be extremely upset because they're throwing everything they have at him? Do you think that there could be real trouble, in the way that Philip is talking about?
Well, I mean, I certainly think that the EU will be very unhappy if he lost, because he's been...
Peter Magyar loses.
Yeah, if Peter Magyar loses, because obviously, Orbán has been, from the EU's perspective, very inconvenient for them over the years, because he's been standing up for his own country's interests and his own interpretation of how things should be, which doesn't align with the sort of technocratic consensus you see in Brussels. So I think obviously he's going to, he's been facing headwinds on this since he came into office, as far as I can see. And since 2010, I think it's only going to it seems to get more intense every cycle. I've only been here 5 years, but I wouldn't be surprised if it gets more intense. Yeah, I mean, the main person I've actually been reading on the election polling has actually been Philip. And so I haven't really got much to say outside of that, because it's just, it's very hard to tell, because the polls are so different. There's so much different information.
Well, talk about, Philip, help our listeners understand what's going on with the Druzhba pipeline and why that has become such an important election issue in Hungary.
Yeah, and since the start of the Iran war, it's become even more so. So basically, a decent portion of the Hungarian oil supply is coming from the Druzhba pipeline.
Through Ukraine.
Through Ukraine from Russia. Now, of course, the opponents of Fidesz and also the very hardcore elements in favor of the Ukraine war will say, well, of course, this should have been shut down years ago. How dare Orbán buy oil from Russia, right? But the fact that it wasn't shut down at the beginning of the war, there's a reason for it, right? The war was managed in at least a semi-rational way, I'd say. And so everybody secured their own energy supply. And the Druzhba pipeline was absolutely key to the Hungarian energy supply.
And Slovakia, too.
And Slovakia, and the region, really, because if the Hungarian and Slovakian oil supply dwindles, they'll start buying from the region. So it's important for Austria and other countries as well. And what's been happening in recent weeks is that the Ukrainians have been weaponizing the Druzhba pipeline, first by preventing oil from flowing through it, and then there was an attack on it. Now, not an attack in Hungarian territory, it was in Russian territory. It was a pumping station out near Tartasan. But it was an attack. It was aimed at the Druzhba pipeline. It was an act of violence against energy infrastructure that the country relies on. And it was very much so against norms. Now, the issue here, the real issue politically, now that is a political issue in and of itself, but Magyar won't say anything about it. And this morning, the Prime Minister's office is saying that they have evidence that the Ukrainians are financing the TISA campaign. So and of course, the TISA campaign also used the Ukrainians to build their app and harvested a bunch of Hungarians' data. So these links between the Ukrainians and the opposition, and the fact that the Ukrainians are using violence to try and interfere in the election, it's completely against European norms, but it's very It's very concerning, actually.
And it's also the case that Hungary and Slovakia have been using their veto within the EU to hold up, it's at a 90 billion euro transfer of European funds to Ukraine. And how do you think that the Iran war, if that chokes off a lot of Europe's oil supply, will it force Brussels to change its mind on the war?
They've already made a statement yesterday. The Financial Times said that the EU is now open to reopening Russian oil supply.
Wow.
Yes, yesterday. They're desperate.
That's
They had a big
extraordinary.
meeting, and so now Viktor Orbán is going to get to do a victory lap and say, I told you so. I told you not to mess with energy security.
Orbán's entire premiership has been, I told you so.
The opposition will now say that the Iran war was launched so that Viktor Orbán could do a victory lap. No doubt.
So let's go to the final question. Outside of immigration, which is the big one, outside of immigration, what else is now fish soup? Or to put it another way, what else is the toothpaste that has come out of the tube that has dramatically affected society, but we can't get it back in? And I can start by saying the introduction of the smartphone in 2007. That was really a red line, because what it did was it gave the internet to everybody all the time. Now we have an entire generation of young people who are accustomed to being online all the time. And this is having dramatic social effects and even neurological effects. There was a survey that came out last year showing dramatic fall off of literacy among the young and mathematical literacy too. And it's almost entirely, I believe, because young people are at a time when their brains were developing, they were constantly online. And neurological studies have shown that that heavy online use affects the parts of the brain, the development of the parts of the brain that make it possible to sustain attention and memory. So I think that future historians will look back to 2007 and the introduction of the smartphone as a Rubicon for not just for Western civilization, but for humanity.
Right. Yeah, I agree, especially with what you're saying, but in general, with technology in general, how it's sort of taken over and being so intrusive, as you say. And the thing with technology, as we all know, is it's a double-edged sword. I mean, we all love it. It helps us do our kinds of work remotely and whatnot. But then the way it's become so intrusive, especially with younger people who haven't had a chance to even develop their brains, and this becomes their sort of epistemology, walking around with the phone. But to me,
what's your toothpaste?
To me, it would be a little more abstract and more philosophical, and it would actually be the thing that connects everything. And you mentioned how migration is the big one, but what else? And it's just it has different names. They call it the left, leftist thinking, wokeist. I think which all of this, of course, when it's all condensed, is a philosophical worldview that has essentially, it's almost like a virus that has taken over, especially Western type people. And it's become, it's what degrades them and breaks them down and makes them susceptible to all sorts of things. If you look at, again,
What is that philosophy?
But if you look at the migrant crisis, for example, that's all self-made as one example. It's a self-made problem. That's why Hungary, Viktor Orbán can, be this nation that's not as powerful as Western Europe or the UK or France. And it doesn't have this issue because he simply put up a fence, which they could have done, but because of this mind virus. So, well, like I said, it has different names. They call it the left. Well, I mean, what would you call it?
Well, globalism, humanitarian universalism?
No, I'm thinking more of leftism, okay? The leftist mentality. I don't want to use the word liberal because liberal is good, but extreme liberalism, wokeism, all of this has just shortchanged the way people think.
And there's
clearly.
no walking that back.
And so I think that's the big genie out of the bottle that needs to be brought back in, to use my version of your analogy.
Yeah. Callum.
Well, I mean, my sense is that everything's now fish soup. I mean, we've all just been
That's
blended.
not helpful.
No, but I'm going somewhere. It's like,
everything's fish soup, nothing's fish.
Well, my point is there's no fish left. I mean, everything is just a big fish. It's completely gone, and we've all just been blended into this. Well, what I mean by everything's gone is that what has gone is stillness, silence, and actually the art of being solitary. Now we hear a lot about loneliness, but I think there's a quote from Robin Williams, and he said, I used to think the worst thing was being alone. Actually, the worst thing is being around people who make you feel alone. We are all now constantly connected to everyone, but it's a very lonely space being constantly online. But actually, the art of actually
paradoxical,
very paradoxical, yeah. But I find that, but the art of being solitary, not lonely, but solitary, of being kind of not having constant stimulation to distract you, having to sit with yourself, that has completely fallen out of the culture now for whole generations. When I even find it myself that if I have a moment of boredom, I can pull my phone out and check the news and see which war has started and check one of Philip's polling analyses, whatever it is. I'm never just left alone to think in a long form way. And that's for our generation, but for the kids coming through now, they've never even experienced it. I at least remember the 90s when I'd spend long summers as a kid wondering what to do, and I'd be creative to fill that space. I haven't had that sort of space for years, and I think the whole culture is militating against being solitary and seeing any value in that.
I think, wasn't Pascal who said that so many of the problems of the world are caused by the inability of man to sit quietly in his room?
Exactly. It's exactly that.
Philip, you get the last word.
Well, I'd say the war, but we've talked about that enough. I do think this war is going to completely change the world. I think we've been in the process of that change for about 5 years, transition to the multipolar world and so on. But I think that's a huge discussion. But to riff off the technological point that you've made, I think the AI discussion, I found it extremely frustrating in a lot of ways because it's often undertaken in a kind of metaphysical dimension. So it's like, will the AI become a sort of a demonic entity or whatever? I think the impact of AI, knowing the technology, how it works quite well. I worked in finance, and 10 years ago we were using LLMs to try and pick up signal in the market. So I mean, I always kind of knew its limits and so on because we tested it very early. I think the real impact of AI is that it could render very large portions of the population illiterate. That's actually my real concern, because if you ever use an AI platform, especially if you use it by voice, which I don't often do, but if you do, you'll see that you can basically put in borderline nonsense and it can kind of read it. It can kind of interpret it. It's kind of impressive in that way, but that's how the technology works. And so I fear that the part of the population that doesn't make an active attempt to learn how to not just read, but probably write at this point, will be rendered illiterate, functionally illiterate. I think this is actually going to happen.
It's happening now.
It's happening already. And what that'll do is it'll mean our culture, or at least the mass culture, will revert to oral culture, which, as we know, being educated people, is quite a primitive form of culture. It's kind of like, it was always the places in the past that would learn to write in Latin that would form civilization, and then beyond the pale, as we say in Holland, would be, these people who'd be telling stories from their ancestors to each other and worshipping the sun. So I do fear that is actually in the process of happening now. We're going to get mass amounts of the population functionally illiterate, even people who we would consider today to be educated, and they'll at first pretend to be literate by using the AI to produce, literary products, or, just basic things. And then over time, it'll become normalized, and people, like Wikipedia was normalized as a citation mechanism. And over time, you'll just go, well, yeah, of course. I mean, everybody's using the AI. And then there'll probably be kind of some sort of a scholar elite that still know how to write, and because I don't think it's actually going to eliminate the writing and the creative thinking. I think it'll just create this enormous class divide between the people who put the effort into writing and the people who are in the kind of oral culture.
Well, the future,
I think this is happening now.
The future could be then politically a sort of feudal society where those who know how to use their brains and who have not had their brains whacked on AI are able to rule over the great mass of people who are functionally illiterate.
Well, we're already there, though.
Or the literate will be a persecuted minority. It's one of the two.
That's possible. Who, me? Read? No. It's like Pol Pot. When Pol Pot took over Cambodia, they shot anybody with glasses thinking they were intellectuals. Yeah. On that happy note, gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. Philip Pilkington, Callum Nicholson, Raymond Ibrahim, and I'm Rod Dreher. Thank you for being with us on View from the Danube.